Captain Arthur Pendleton thought he owned the sky. With 30 years in the left seat, he believed the cockpit was an exclusive boys' club, and he wasn't shy about making that known. So when he walked onto his Boeing 777 and saw a young black woman sitting in the co-pilot's seat, his immediate reaction was pure, unfiltered disdain. He grabbed his phone, demanding a replacement, completely unaware that the quiet woman he was insulting wasn't a rookie. She was the FAA's chief flight examiner. The harsh fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 reflected off the gold bars on Captain Arthur Pendleton's shoulders. At 58 years old, Arthur was a relic of a bygone era of aviation. He walked with a heavy, arrogant swagger, his rolling flight bag clicking rhythmically against the polished terrazzo floors. To Arthur, flying wasn't a team effort. It was a dictatorship, and he was the undisputed king. He had flown for global continental airlines for over 2 decades, transitioning from the military, where he flew fighters, to the sprawling flight decks of commercial heavy metal. Today's assignment was Flight 842, a heavy Boeing 777-300ER, bound for London Heathrow. It was a route Arthur could fly, blindfolded, a 10-hour transatlantic hop over the pond. He stopped by the crew dispatch room to pick up his paperwork and review the weather. Handing his badge to the dispatcher, a young man named Brendan Arthur didn't even bother to make eye contact. "Morning, Artie. Got your dispatch release right here," Brendan said, sliding a thick stack of printed papers across the counter. "Looks like you have a last-minute schedule change for your first officer. Your usual guy, Greg, called in sick. Food poisoning, I think." Arthur frowned, finally looking up. "Who did they stick me with, Brendan? Don't tell me it's one of those kids fresh out of the right seat of a regional jet. I don't have the patience to babysit a millennial all the way to London." Brendan glanced at his screen, looking slightly uncomfortable. No. Looks like a reserve pilot. M. Reynolds. I don't see a lot of hours on the line with us, but she's cleared for the 777. Arthur scoffed, snatching the papers. "She. Fantastic. Just what I need." Another diversity hire pushed through the system to make the corporate brochures look good. "Thanks, Brendan. I'll be sure to hold her hand during the crosswind landing." Arthur stormed out of dispatch, his blood already boiling. He hated the modern airline industry. He hated the new crew resource management, CRM protocols that forced him to treat his co-pilots as equals rather than subordinates. But mostly he hated anyone who didn't fit his narrow, outdated mold of what a pilot should look like. When Arthur stepped through the heavy reinforced door of the 777's flight deck, the auxiliary power unit was already humming. The myriad of screens and instruments were lit up, bathing the cockpit in a soft, glowing light. And there, sitting in the right seat, was his new first officer. Maya Reynolds was 34 years old, but her calm, commanding presence made her seem far older. She was a black woman, with her hair pulled back into a neat professional bun, wearing a crisp white uniform shirt and the 3 stripes of a first officer. What Arthur didn't know, what absolutely nobody at Global Continental knew, was that Maya wasn't a reserve pilot at all. She was an undercover evaluator, the highest-ranking chief flight examiner for the Federal Aviation Administration in the region. She had been sent explicitly to conduct a random unannounced line check on Global Continental's senior captains, following a series of anonymous safety complaints regarding toxic cockpit culture. "Good evening, Captain," Maya said, her voice steady and polite, as Arthur threw his bag into the corner with unnecessary force. "I'm Maya Reynolds. I'll be your first officer tonight." Arthur didn't extend his hand. He didn't even offer a polite nod. He just stared at her, his eyes raking over her uniform as if searching for a flaw. "Reynolds," He grunted, sliding into the left seat and adjusting his headset. Let's get one thing straight right now. I don't know who you know at corporate or what quota they were trying to fill when they put you in this seat, but my flight deck is not a training ground. You touch the radios when I tell you to. You run the checklists when I tell you to. And if things get hairy, you sit on your hands and let me fly the airplane. Understood. Maya didn't flinch. Her expression remained completely neutral. Inside, however, she was already filing a mental report. Hostile work environment. Immediate breakdown of crew resource management. Prejudicial bias. Understood, Captain. Maya replied evenly, returning her attention to the flight management computer, FMC. She had deliberately left one minor non-critical waypoint out of the routing, waiting to see if Arthur would catch it during his cross-check. Arthur settled into his seat, visibly agitated. Don't just say, understood, like a robot. How many hours do you even have in a wide-body 500, 1,000? Maya kept her eyes on the screen, her fingers dancing rapidly across the keypad. I have sufficient hours to be fully type-rated on the 777, Captain. It was a massive understatement. Maya had over 12,000 hours of flight time, had been a test pilot for Boeing, and had literally written the revised safety manual for this exact aircraft. Right. Sufficient, Arthur muttered, shaking his head. He pulled out his phone and immediately drafted a text to his fleet manager. Got stuck with a diversity hire. M. Reynolds. No experience. If she screws up, I'm tossing her out of the cockpit. Just wanted it on record. He hit send, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction. He was establishing a paper trail, preparing to blame her for any minor inconvenience that might occur during the flight. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every sigh of contempt, was being meticulously catalogued by the woman sitting less than 3 feet away from him. The boarding process began, the muffled sounds of hundreds of passengers shuffling down the jet bridge, bleeding into the cockpit. Arthur was furiously clicking through the overhead panel, snapping switches with a practiced, aggressive speed. He was moving too fast, relying purely on muscle memory rather than following the flow of the pre-flight checklist. This was a classic hallmark of complacency, a dangerous trait in aviation that Maya was explicitly trained to look for. The cockpit door chimed, and Sarah Jenkins, the chief purser, stepped in. Sarah was a seasoned flight attendant in her late 40s, and she knew Arthur's reputation well. She offered a warm, somewhat apologetic smile to Maya. Evening, Captain Pendleton. Evening, First Officer, Sarah said, handing Arthur a cup of black coffee. Boarding is about halfway done. We're looking at a full house tonight, 340 passengers. Arthur took the coffee without a word of thanks. Make sure they sit down fast, Sarah. I want to push back early. And keep the flight deck door locked tight tonight. I don't want any distractions. He shot a sideways glance at Maya. I'm already going to be working double time up here, managing the right seat. Sarah's smile faltered. She looked at Maya, expecting to see embarrassment or anger, but Maya just gave Sarah a reassuring, subtle nod. Understood, Captain, Sarah said tightly, stepping back out and closing the heavy reinforced door behind her. All right, let's run the pre-flight checklist, Arthur barked, finally looking at the screens. You know how to read a checklist, right? Yes, Captain, Maya said smoothly, pulling up the electronic display. Pre-flight checklist. Oxygen. Tested 100%. Arthur interrupted, not actually checking the gauge. Maya noted the deviation. Captain, the gauge shows 1,800 psi, which is sufficient, but standard operating procedure requires a physical flow test. Arthur turned to her, his face turning a shade of crimson. Listen to me, Reynolds. I was flying these heavy jets when you were still in middle school. The oxygen was tested by maintenance 3 hours ago. I don't need you quoting the manual at me. Just read the next item. Maya did not argue. She knew that arguing with a pilot of his temperament during a high workload phase was unproductive. Instead, she reached into her flight bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, resting it on her kneeboard. She unclicked a silver pen and made a single precise check mark. Flight instruments. Maya continued her voice, devoid of any emotion. Set and checked, Arthur snapped. Parking brake, Maya read. Set. The routine continued with Arthur rushing through the vital checks, eager to prove that he didn't need a first officer, let alone one he deemed beneath him. As they reached the final items on the list, a yellow advisory message illuminated on the engine indicating and crew alerting system EICAS screen. It was a minor fault message regarding a redundant bleed air valve on the right engine. Maya tapped the screen. Captain, we have a bleed air advisory on engine 2. It looks like a sensor fault. We should consult the minimum equipment list MEL before we call for pushback. Arthur rolled his eyes, letting out an exaggerated groan. It's a glitch. The 777 has 1 million sensors and half of them cry wolf. We have a redundant system. I'm not delaying this flight for an hour, so maintenance can come out here, scratch their heads and reset a breaker. Clear the message. Captain, the FAA mandate and our company operations manual require us to verify any EICAS message against the MEL prior to pushback, Maya stated firmly. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was giving him a direct opportunity to correct a safety violation. Arthur leaned forward, pointing a thick, calloused finger just inches from Maya's face. Let me explain something to you, sweetheart. I make the command decisions on this airplane. Not the FAA, not a book, and certainly not a green co-pilot who got her job through a diversity initiative. Clear. The message. Maya held his gaze for 3 long seconds. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, save for the hum of the avionics cooling fans. She knew right then that Arthur Pendleton's career was effectively over. It was no longer a question of if she would ground him, but when. She reached up and pressed the cancel button, clearing the yellow text from the screen. Message cleared, Captain, Maya said softly. She clicked her pen again. Willful violation of maintenance protocols. Insubordination to safety mandates. Aggressive intimidation tactics. At 8:45 p.m., the boarding doors were closed. The tug was attached to the nose gear, ready to push the massive 300-ton aircraft away from the gate. Arthur picked up his radio mic, switching over to O'Hare ground control. O'Hare ground, Global 842. Heavy ready for push and start at gate K16. Global 842. Heavy cleared for push and start, face east. Altimeter 29.92. The controller's voice crackled through the speakers. Cleared for push facing east Global 842, Arthur replied. He turned off his microphone and looked at Maya. All right, just sit there and watch how a real pilot handles this plane. The pushback was smooth, the massive GE-90 engines roaring to life one by one, shaking the floorboards of the flight deck with raw, controlled power. It was a dark, drizzly night in Chicago. The tarmac was a sea of blue and green taxi lights, reflecting off the wet concrete. Navigating O'Hare at night required absolute concentration, which was exactly why the FAA enforced the sterile cockpit rule. Below 10,000 feet, and during all taxi operations, pilots were strictly forbidden from discussing anything other than the immediate operation of the aircraft. Arthur, however, felt the rules did not apply to him. As they taxied toward runway 28 right, Arthur decided it was the perfect time to give Maya an unprompted lecture. You know the problem with this industry today. is that it's gone soft. Arthur began steering the tiller with his left hand while keeping his right hand resting lazily on the thrust levers. Used to be you had to earn this seat. You had to spend 10 years flying cargo through thunderstorms in Anchorage before they even let you look at a passenger jet. Now they just fast-track people like you, because the HR department wants a nice photo for their Instagram page. Maya was monitoring the taxiway center lines, cross-referencing their position on the airport diagram. Captain, we are approaching taxiway November. Ground instructed us to hold short of November until the American Airlines 737 passes. I see the American. Arthur dismissed not slowing down. He's moving slow. I can easily make the crossing before he gets here. Captain, we were instructed to hold short, Maya warned, her voice elevating slightly. This was a runway incursion waiting to happen. Arthur grunted, slamming on the toe brakes a bit too hard. The massive aircraft jerked to a halt, the nose gear compressing heavily. Through the rain-slicked windshield, the American 737 rolled past them on the intersecting taxiway, a little closer than comfortable. See plenty of room, Arthur muttered defensively. You panic too easily. That's what happens when you lack real-world experience. Maya said nothing. She keyed her microphone. O'Hare Ground Global 842 Heavy. We are holding short at November. Global 842 Heavy. Roger, follow the American 737 Monitor Tower on 120.9. Follow the American, switching to Tower 120.9, Global 842. Maya read back flawlessly. Arthur snorted. Wow, you can read a radio frequency. They must have taught you that in your special fast track academy. Maya ignored the jab. She dialed in the tower frequency. They were cleared for takeoff a few minutes later. As the 777 lined up on the center line of runway, 28 right, Arthur pushed the thrust levers forward. The immense power pinned them back in their seats as the aircraft hurtled down the runway, throwing up a massive spray of water behind them. V1! Maya called out, marking the speed at which takeoff could no longer be aborted. Rotate, she called a second later. Arthur pulled back on the yoke, and the heavy jet broke the surly bonds of Earth, climbing steeply into the dark, cloudy Chicago sky. The landing gear thumped heavily as it retracted into the belly of the plane. For the first 10 minutes of the climb, the workload was high, and Arthur was forced to focus on flying. But as soon as they passed 10,000 feet, the sterile cockpit rule ended. A chime echoed through the cabin, signaling to the flight attendants that they could begin their service. Arthur immediately reached up and hit the autopilot button. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his eyes, and let out a long, dramatic sigh. All right, Arthur said, his tone dripping with condescension. You handled the radios well enough, I suppose. But let's be real, Reynolds. How did you actually get this gig? Did you sue somebody? Or did they just give you a free pass on the simulator checks? Maya finally turned to look directly at him. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely unafraid. I passed my simulator checks with perfect scores, Captain Pendleton. I earned my type ratings the exact same way you did, through hours of study practice and check rides. Arthur laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Right. Sure you did. Look, I don't care what they told you at corporate, but up here, I'm the law. And frankly, I don't feel safe having someone with your background backing me up if an engine fails over the Atlantic. Before Maya could respond, Arthur leaned over to the center console and pulled up the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS. It was a digital data link system used to send text-based messages directly to the airline's dispatch and management teams on the ground. Arthur began typing furiously, not caring that Maya could see the screen. To Chief Pilot. Global Continental from Captain. Pendleton Flight 842. Subject unacceptable FO assignment. Message currently climbing through flight level 220. My FOM Reynolds is dangerously inexperienced and entirely unsuited for this aircraft. It is obvious she is a diversity quota hire. Her presence compromises the safety of my flight deck. I am requesting she be immediately reassigned upon our arrival in London, and I expect a new first officer for my return flight. I refuse to fly with her again. Arthur hit send. The screen flashed, confirming the message was transmitted to the company's servers via satellite. It was now a permanent legal record. Arthur looked at Maya, a triumphant smirk on his face. There. Now it's on the record. If anything goes wrong tonight, it's on you and the idiots who hired you. Maya watched the transmission confirmation disappear from the screen. She felt a profound sense of pity for the man sitting next to her. He had just handed her a written confession of his own prejudice filed on a company system while actively commanding a commercial flight. "Yes, Captain," Maya said quietly, her voice smooth as silk. "It is absolutely on the record." She reached for her kneeboard, unclicked her silver pen, and began to write. This wasn't just a line check anymore. This was about to be an execution. The Boeing 777 cruised seamlessly at 35,000 feet, flight level 350, cutting through the cold, thin air over the North Atlantic Ocean. The glow of the instrument panels bathed the cockpit in an eerie ambient light, casting long shadows across Captain Arthur Pendleton's face. They were 2 hours into the flight, having just passed the coast of Newfoundland, entering the oceanic track system, where radar coverage was sparse and pilots relied on high-frequency HF radios and satellite data links to communicate with air traffic control. Arthur had spent the last hour in a state of relaxed negligence. He had his feet propped up on the footrests beneath the rudder pedals, a violation of company policy during oceanic crossings, and was casually scrolling through a golf magazine on his personal tablet. He hadn't spoken a word to Maya since sending his vindictive ACARS message to the chief pilot. Maya, on the other hand, was the picture of vigilant professionalism. She sat upright, monitoring the flight instruments, cross-checking their fuel burn against the flight plan, and listening attentively to the static-laced HF radio. She was also keeping a very close eye on the engine, indicating, and crew alerting system, EICAS display. The minor bleed air advisory that Arthur had dismissed on the ground had not magically resolved itself. In fact, Maya had noticed subtle fluctuations in the cabin pressurization metrics over the last 20 minutes. The Boeing 777 is a magnificent piece of engineering designed with multiple redundancies, but when an ignored fault compounds with atmospheric pressure changes, those redundancies can quickly unravel. "Captain," Maya said, breaking the long silence. Her voice was calm but carried a distinct edge of urgency. "I'm seeing a steady increase in the cabin altitude rate of climb. The pressurization controller is struggling to maintain the schedule. The duct pressure on the right engine bleed system is fluctuating wildly." Arthur let out an exasperated sigh, not looking up from his magazine. "It's just the automatic controller hunting for the right valve position, Reynolds. Stop babysitting the dials. It's a heavy jet it breathes." "It's not hunting, Captain. It's failing," Maya corrected, pointing a slender finger at the screen. "The advisory we had on the ground for the right engine bleed valve, the valve is sticking. It's dumping compressed air before it reaches the packs to pressurize the cabin." "I told you on the ground the system is redundant," Arthur snapped, finally tossing his tablet onto his flight bag. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "The left engine bleed is picking up the slack. We're fine." Just as the words left his mouth, A loud synthetic chime echoed through the flight deck. Bing bong! A bright yellow master caution light illuminated on the glare shield directly in front of both pilots. On the EICAS screen, a new message flashed in stark yellow text, "Bleed leak RENG." Simultaneously, the cabin rate of climb indicator spiked. They were losing pressurization. "Right engine bleed leak," Meyer announced, immediately reaching for the quick reference handbook, QR. H, a thick binder containing emergency checklists. "I have the QR, H, bleed leak right engine checklist. Step 1. Right engine. Bleed air, switch off." Hold on. Arthur barked, his hands hovering over the overhead panel, his face suddenly flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and panic. "If we shut off the right bleed, we're relying entirely on the left pack to keep us pressurized. If that fails, we're doing an emergency descent into the middle of the ocean. Captain, the checklist is not optional." Meyer stated, her eyes locked on his. "A bleed leak means 400-degree air is currently venting uncontrollably into the engine strut or wing leading edge. It poses a severe fire hazard and structural risk. Step 1. Right engine, bleed air, switch off." Arthur hesitated. The arrogance that had defined his entire persona evaporated, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing indecision. He was used to textbook flights. He hadn't faced a genuine cascading mechanical failure in over a decade, and his complacency had dulled his instincts. He stared at the overhead panel, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the switch, second-guessing the procedure. "Arthur, execute the checklist," Meyer commanded. The captain, honorific, was gone. The shift in her tone was so abrupt, so saturated with absolute, unyielding authority that Arthur physically flinched. He flipped the right bleed air switch to the off position. "Switch off," he muttered, his breathing growing shallow. "Right pack switch off." Meyer continued reading the QRH with the speed and precision of a metronome. Arthur flipped the pack switch. For a terrifying 5 seconds, the cockpit was silent, save for the rush of wind outside. But the situation was not stabilizing. The master warning alarm, a piercing, continuous wail, suddenly shattered the quiet. The entire cockpit bathed in flashing red light. Cabin altitude flashed in bold red letters on the screen. The single remaining air conditioning pack on the left engine could not keep up with the volume of the 777's massive cabin. The pressure was dropping too fast. "Cabin altitude is passing 10,000 feet, Meyer called out, her voice cutting through the blaring alarm. The automated warning system began to scream, a computerized voice. "Cabin altitude. Cabin altitude." In the passenger cabin behind them, rubber masks were automatically dropping from the ceiling, unleashing a wave of panic among the 340 souls on board. "Oxygen masks on," Meyer ordered. She grabbed her quick-donning oxygen mask, squeezing the red release tabs, and snapped it over her face in less than 2 seconds. She flipped the toggle switch on her audio panel to route her microphone through the mask. Arthur was fumbling. His hands, thick and clumsy with sudden panic, struggled with the straps of his mask. He dropped it onto his lap, cursing loudly, before finally wrestling it onto his face. His eyes were wide with terror. He looked at Meyer, completely overwhelmed. The king of the cockpit was frozen. I have control," Arthur stammered through his mask, but his hands were trembling on the yoke, inadvertently disengaging the autopilot with a harsh clack, clack, clack sound. The heavy jet pitched up, slightly losing speed. "Negative." Meyer's voice boomed through the intercom system, crystal clear and chillingly composed. "You are incapacitated by task saturation. I have the aircraft." Meyer didn't wait for his permission. She slammed her hands onto her control yoke and depressed the autopilot override button. She pushed the nose of the Boeing 777 down, arresting the dangerous loss of airspeed Arthur had just caused. "My aircraft," Maya repeated forcefully. Arthur let go of his yoke as if it were electrified, sinking back into his seat, his chest heaving under his safety harness. He was completely out of his depth, and they both knew it. Maya's hands moved in a blur of practiced methodical action. She deployed the speed brakes to create drag and retarded the thrust levers to idle. Gander Center, Global 8-4-2. Heavy Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Maya broadcasted over the emergency frequency, her breathing steady and controlled beneath the mask. Rapid depressurization. Initiating emergency descent to flight level 100. We are deviating 15 miles right of track. Global 842 Heavy Gander Center. Mayday received. The Canadian controller responded instantly, prioritizing their crisis. Descend at pilot's discretion to flight level 100, altimeter 29.85. You have the airspace. The massive Boeing 777 pitched down into a steep, controlled dive. The sky outside the windows shifted as they plummeted toward the cloud deck below. Maya flew the aircraft with mathematical precision, managing the airspeed perfectly to balance the fastest possible descent without overstressing the airframe. She glanced over at Arthur. He was gripping his armrests, his eyes glued to the artificial horizon, hyperventilating into his oxygen mask. The man who had mocked her experience just an hour prior was now a passenger in his own flight deck. "Arthur," Maya said sharply through the intercom, "pull yourself together. Run the passenger oxygen switch to on to ensure positive flow to the cabin and advise the flight attendants to secure themselves." It took Arthur 3 seconds to register the command. He shakily reached up, flipping the passenger oxygen switch. He picked up the PA handset, but his hand was trembling so violently he dropped it. Maya sighed a sharp digital burst of static over the radio. She reached over, grabbed the handset, and pressed the PA button. "Attention, flight attendants. This is the flight deck. Secure yourselves immediately. Passengers remain seated with your masks securely fastened. We are performing a controlled descent to a safer altitude. We have the situation managed." Her voice, ringing through the cabin, wasn't the frantic bark of a panicked pilot. It was the soothing, ironclad assurance of someone who was in absolute command of the sky. The Boeing 777 leveled off at 10,000 feet, the dense lower atmosphere, providing enough breathable oxygen so the crew and passengers could safely remove their masks. Maya re-engaged the autopilot, adjusting the thrust levers to maintain a steady cruising speed. The piercing alarms had been silenced, replaced by the heavy rhythmic breathing of Captain Arthur Pendleton. Maya pulled her oxygen mask off and let it hang from its hook. She smoothed her hair, her expression unreadable. She turned to Arthur, who was slowly peeling his mask away, his face pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "The aircraft is stable at 10,000 feet," Maya reported cleanly, as if she were reading a grocery list rather than concluding a harrowing emergency descent. "Pressurization is equalized. Both engines are running, but the right bleed is isolated. We cannot continue to London unpressurized at this altitude. We don't have the fuel." Arthur swallowed hard, trying to regain a sliver of his shattered ego. He sat up straighter, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Right. Right, of course. Good. Good descent, Reynolds. But I'm taking the aircraft back now. My controls." He reached for the yoke. "Negative," Maya said, her hand resting firmly on the center console, blocking his access to the thrust levers. "You surrendered control when you froze during a critical emergency phase. You disengaged the autopilot and induced a pitch-up attitude during a depressurization event. I am acting pilot in command for the remainder of this flight." Arthur's face flushed dark red anger, rapidly replacing his fear. "Listen to me, you little upstart. I am the captain of this vessel. You are a first officer. I panicked for a second. It happens to everyone. Now give me back my airplane before I have you arrested for mutiny when we land." Maya didn't blink. She reached into her flight bag, pulling out her leather-bound notebook. "It doesn't happen to everyone, Arthur. It happens to complacent pilots who ignore safety advisories on the ground and fail to maintain situational awareness in the air. We are diverting to Halifax Stanfield International Airport. It's 80 miles off our nose." "We are not going to Halifax," Arthur shouted, slamming his fist onto the glare shield. "We are turning around and going back to Boston or JFK. Global Continental has maintenance bases there. If we land in Halifax, we strand a 777 in Canada, and corporate will have my head. Corporate will not be your primary concern," Maya replied coolly. She keyed the radio. "Gander Center Global 842 Heavy. We are stable at 10,000 feet. Requesting immediate vectors for an emergency diversion to Halifax. Global 842. Heavy cleared direct Halifax. Contact Halifax approach on 119.2. Good luck, 842. Arthur unbuckled his harness, leaning aggressively toward Maya. "I am ordering you to turn this plane to Boston. You do not have the authority to make this decision. I will ruin your career, Reynolds. I will make sure you never see the inside of a cockpit again." The flight deck door chimed and burst open. Sarah Jenkins, the chief purser, stumbled in. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked terrified. "Captain, the cabin is a mess. We have passengers hyperventilating, and one elderly man might be having a cardiac event from the stress. We need to land now." Sarah looked between Arthur, who was standing half out of his seat, screaming, and Maya, who was calmly programming the diversion route into the flight computer. "We are landing in Halifax in approximately 22 minutes, Sarah," Maya said, offering the purser a reassuring nod. "Coordinate with the ground medical teams via satellite phone. Tell them to meet us at the gate. I have the aircraft." Sarah looked at Arthur, waiting for his confirmation. "She does not have the aircraft," Arthur bellowed. "Sarah, get out of the flight deck. Reynolds, get out of that seat. I am taking command." Maya finished typing the approach coordinates into the FMC. She slowly turned in her seat to face Arthur. The air in the cockpit grew freezing cold despite the heating system. "Arthur," Maya said softly, but the sheer gravity of her voice made both Arthur and Sarah freeze. "Sit down, buckle your harness, and do not touch a single instrument on my flight deck." "Your flight deck?" Arthur spat, a bitter, desperate laugh escaping his lips. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Maya reached into the breast pocket of her crisp white uniform shirt. She didn't pull out a company ID. She pulled out a solid brass badge housed in a black leather wallet and flipped it open. The federal seal of the United States Department of Transportation gleamed in the dim light. "I am Maya Reynolds, Chief Flight Examiner for the Federal Aviation Administration Eastern Region," she said, watching the blood completely drain from Arthur's face. "I am here conducting an undercover line check on your performance, Captain Pendleton, a performance that has resulted in 3 critical safety violations, gross insubordination to standard operating procedures, and a total loss of aircraft control during a Mayday emergency." Arthur fell back into his seat, as if he had been shot. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The badge caught the light, a heavy, undeniable symbol of absolute authority. Furthermore, Maya continued her eyes, pinning him to his seat. "As a federal evaluator, I have the statutory authority to suspend a pilot's certificate in the air if I deem them an immediate threat to aviation safety. Consider your airline transport pilot certificate suspended, Mr. Pendleton. You are now a passenger in the jump seat. If you interfere with my operation of this aircraft, I will have the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrest you upon our arrival in Halifax for interfering with a flight crew." Sarah Jenkins covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, before a slow, undeniable smile crept across her face. "I'll go check on that passenger, Captain Reynolds," Sarah said, intentionally emphasizing the title. She stepped out and locked the door behind her. Arthur sat in the left seat, a broken man. He stared blankly at the instruments, the realization of his ruined career crashing down on him with the weight of the 777. Suddenly, the ACARS system chimed loudly. A message had arrived from company dispatch. Maya reached over and tapped the screen to open it. It was a reply to the vindictive message Arthur had sent an hour prior. To Captain, Pendleton Flight 842, from VP Flight Operations, Global Continental Subject, RAFO Assignment Message. Arthur, do not send messages of this nature on company frequencies. Be advised, FOM Reynolds is an FAA Chief Examiner conducting a random audit of your flight. You are advised to offer her full cooperation. Any hostile behavior will result in immediate disciplinary action. Maya read the message in silence. She glanced at Arthur, who had his head in his hands, trembling. "It seems corporate just read your email, Arthur." Maya said, her tone devoid of sympathy, as she banked the massive jet toward the sparkling coastal lights of Halifax in the distance. "Let's hope your landing is better than your judgment." Halifax Stanfield International Airport was shrouded in a thick maritime fog, an unyielding soup of grey that reduced visibility to a bare minimum. The wind was howling off the North Atlantic, whipping across the runways at 30 knots, gusting to 45. It was the kind of weather that tested even the most seasoned aviators, let alone a crew operating a crippled aircraft that was tens of thousands of pounds over its maximum landing weight. In the left seat of the Boeing 777, Arthur Pendleton sat motionless, his hands resting limply on his lap. The glow of the instruments illuminated the sheer devastation on his face. The ACARS message from corporate was still burning a hole in his mind, a digital tombstone for his 30-year career. In the right seat, Maya Reynolds was a machine. Halifax approach, Global 842. Heavy descending to 3,000 feet, established on the localizer for runway 14. Maya transmitted her voice cutting cleanly through the heavy radio static. "Global 842, Heavy Halifax Tower, you are cleared to land. Runway 14. Winds are 160 at 30, gusting 45. Emergency equipment is standing by. Be advised, braking action is reported as fair to poor, due to heavy rain. Cleared to land, runway 14. Global 842. Heavy." Maya acknowledged. She keyed the intercom. "Sarah, prepare the cabin for an overweight landing. Impact may be firmer than usual. Instruct passengers to brace on my command." "Understood, Captain Reynolds. Cabin is secured. Medical is ready at the gate for our cardiac passenger," Sarah replied instantly. Maya reached over to the center pedestal and dialed the auto brakes to maximum. Landing a Boeing 777, fully loaded with oceanic fuel, meant they were coming in heavy and fast. The kinetic energy generated upon touchdown would be massive, risking blown tires or overheated brakes. Arthur finally found his voice, a weak, raspy croak that barely sounded like the tyrant who had swaggered onto the flight deck in Chicago. "Maya, Reynolds, the crosswind. It's severe. The plane is too heavy. You're going to need to crab it aggressively into the wind until the flare or the landing gear will collapse on the right side." It was a desperate attempt to prove he still had value, a final grasp at his fading authority. Maya didn't even turn her head. "I am aware of the aerodynamics of this aircraft, Mr. Pendleton. Please retrieve the overweight landing checklist from the Quick Reference Handbook and read it aloud. Arthur hesitated, the ultimate humiliation settling over him. He, a senior captain, was being ordered to read a checklist like a junior cadet on his first day. He reached with trembling hands, pulling the heavy binder into his lap. Overweight. Overweight landing checklist. Arthur stammered, his eyes struggling to focus on the text. Flaps. Set 30. Flaps 30 set. Maya confirmed, her hand moving the lever. VREF speed. Calculate for current gross weight. Calculated and bugged at 162 knots, Maya replied, her eyes scanning the primary flight display. The massive jet was being buffeted violently by the crosswinds, the nose yawing left and right, but Maya's hands on the yoke were making minute, instantaneous corrections. She was flying the 300-ton aircraft with the delicate precision of a surgeon. They broke through the cloud deck at 400 feet. The runway lights of Halifax suddenly materialized through the driving rain, a glowing ladder laid out against the black, wet tarmac. The plane was crabbing heavily, the nose pointed nearly 15 degrees away from the center line to compensate for the gale force winds. Minimums, the automated voice called out in the cockpit. Landing, Maya stated. Brace, 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 she commanded over the PA system. At 50 feet, Maya smoothly applied left rudder to align the nose with the runway, simultaneously dropping the right wing to counteract the wind pushing them off the center line. It was a flawless crosswind slip, executed at the absolute limit of the aircraft's aerodynamic envelope. The right main landing gear touched down first with a heavy jarring thud, instantly followed by the left, and finally the nose gear. Speed brakes up, thrust reversers normal, Maya called out immediately, pulling the massive levers back. The GE-90 engines roared in protest, throwing a massive spray of water forward as the maximum auto brakes bit into the carbon discs. The heavy jet shuddered violently, fighting the momentum of its immense weight before finally decelerating to a safe taxi speed with 3,000 feet of runway remaining. Global 842, heavy, excellent job. Take taxiway Delta and follow the Follow Me truck to gate 24. Emergency vehicles will trail you. The Halifax Tower controller said, a hint of awe in his voice. Roger, taking Delta to gate 24. Global 842. Maya replied, her breathing perfectly steady. As they rolled into the gate, the flashing red and blue lights of the Halifax emergency services painted the interior of the cockpit in a chaotic strobe. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police cruisers had the gate surrounded. Maya set the parking brake and cut the fuel switches. The engine spun down, a heavy, exhausted silence falling over the flight deck. Ground personnel are connecting the bridge, Maya said, filling out the aircraft logbook. Medical is coming aboard first. Arthur unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the metal clasp. He looked at Maya, his eyes red-rimmed and defeated. Maya, look. What happens now, I've been flying for 30 years. It's all I know. You can't just end it over one mistake. Maya closed the logbook and finally turned to look at him fully. There was no anger in her eyes, only a cold, clinical disappointment. It wasn't one mistake, Arthur, she said quietly. It was a systemic failure of leadership. You ignored a maintenance fault because of arrogance. You violated sterile cockpit rules to deliver a prejudiced lecture. You deliberately endangered the aircraft on the ground to prove a point. And when a legitimate emergency arose, your complacency caused you to freeze, putting 340 lives at risk. You didn't just fail a line check tonight. You failed the fundamental duty of a pilot. The reinforced door clicked open. Sarah Jenkins stepped in, followed closely by 2 paramedics and a stern-looking officer from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. "Captain Reynolds, the paramedics have the passenger. He's stable," Sarah reported. The RCMP officer stepped forward, looking between the two pilots, his eyes settling on Arthur's haggard appearance, and then on Maya's absolute composure. "Which one of you is in command of this vessel?" Maya stood up, sliding her FAA badge back into her pocket. "I am Maya Reynolds, acting pilot in command. The aircraft is secure." The officer nodded. "And Captain Pendleton, Mr. Pendleton's pilot certificate has been federally suspended." Maya stated, her voice carrying out into the forward galley where passengers were beginning to disembark. "He is to be escorted off the aircraft and released to the custody of Global Continental's local station manager pending a federal inquiry. He is no longer authorized to access restricted aviation areas." Arthur stood up, his gold-striped epaulets suddenly looking like cheap costume jewelry. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. The bluster was entirely gone. Escorted by the RCMP officer, Arthur Pendleton picked up his flight bag and walked off the flight deck of a Boeing 777 for the absolute last time in his life. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Conference Room A at the Federal Aviation Administration's regional headquarters in Chicago was stifling. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the highest-ranking officials in commercial aviation, the FAA Regional Director, Global Continental's VP of Flight Operations, the Chief Pilot and union representatives. Arthur Pendleton sat at the far end of the table, wearing a rumpled grey suit. He looked 10 years older, the arrogance completely hollowed out of him. Across from him sat Maya Reynolds, dressed in her crisp, immaculate captain's uniform. Director William Crawford, a stern man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the thick binder of evidence in front of him. "Mr. Pendleton," Director Crawford began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "The board has reviewed the cockpit voice recorder, transcripts, the flight data recorder telemetry, and the sworn testimony of Chief Examiner Reynolds Chief Purser Jenkins and Halifax Air Traffic Control." Crawford flipped a page. "Your union representative has argued that your temporary incapacitation during the depressurization event was a medically induced panic attack, and that your 30 years of unblemished service should warrant a suspension and retraining rather than a revocation of your air transport pilot certificate." Arthur nodded weakly, looking down at his hands. Director I froze. It was a momentary lapse. "But I have 30,000 hours in the sky. I know how to fly. Knowing how to fly an airplane in perfect weather is not why we pay captains $300,000 a year," Arthur interrupted David Mitchell, the chief pilot for Global Continental. David looked furious. "We pay captains to manage disasters. You didn't manage it. You created it." Furthermore, Director Crawford continued, pulling out a printed sheet of paper. "We have the ACR's transmission you sent at flight level 220. Arthur closed his eyes. "The digital death warrant." Crawford read the message aloud to the silent room. "My FOM Reynolds is dangerously inexperienced. It is obvious she is a diversity quota hire. Her presence compromises the safety of my flight deck." Crawford dropped the paper onto the table in disgust. "Mr. Pendleton, you transmitted a hostile, prejudiced, and wildly inaccurate message regarding an FAA chief examiner on an open company network, while you were supposed to be monitoring an active flight profile. You induced a hostile work environment that explicitly destroyed crew resource management, the very foundation of modern aviation safety." Maya leaned forward, resting her hands on the mahogany table. "Arthur," Maya said, her voice commanding the immediate attention of everyone in the room. "You claimed you didn't know me, but I know you." Arthur looked up, confused. 7 years ago, I was a junior first officer, flying right seat on a 737 out of Newark. Maya continued, her eyes locking onto his. We were flying through a severe winter storm. I pointed out ice accumulation on the wings during taxi and requested a secondary de-icing. You told me to shut my mouth, told me I was a quota hire who didn't understand winter operations, and you attempted to take off. I had to physically block the thrust levers and call ground control to force us back to the pad. Arthur's face went chalk white as the memory suddenly surfaced. You used your seniority to have me quietly transferred to another fleet the next day, burying the incident report, Maya said coldly. But I didn't quit. I studied. I trained. I became a test pilot. I became an examiner. I made it my life's mission to ensure that pilots with your toxic, dangerous mentality were systematically removed from the sky before you killed somebody. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Director Crawford didn't even consult the other board members. The decision had been made the moment Maya landed that plane in Halifax. Arthur Pendleton, Crawford said, signing the document in front of him with a heavy stroke of his pen. Effective immediately, your airline transport pilot certificate is permanently revoked. You are barred from holding any commercial flying license within the jurisdiction of the Federal Aviation Administration. Global Continental Airlines is formally terminating your employment effective today. Arthur didn't say a word. He stood up slowly, the weight of his shattered legacy crushing his shoulders, and walked out of the room, leaving his career behind in the dust. Later that evening, Maya Reynolds stood at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of O'Hare's terminal, 3 watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. A Boeing 777 was pushing back from the gate, its anti-collision lights flashing rhythmically against the twilight. The industry was changing. The old guard, the cowboys of the sky, who ruled with fear and prejudice, were being grounded. The flight deck was no longer a dictatorship. It was a place for professionals, for teamwork, and for absolute, uncompromising excellence. Maya smiled, checking her watch. She picked up her rolling flight bag. She had a flight to command to Tokyo, and she was looking forward to meeting her new first officer. The sky belongs to those who respect it, and Captain Maya Reynolds proved that true leadership isn't about arrogance. It's about absolute competence when the alarms start blaring. Arthur Pendleton learned the hard way that prejudice and complacency are the deadliest combinations in aviation, and karma flies at 35,000 feet. If you were on the edge of your seat during this intense mid-air drama and want more thrilling real-life aviation stories and workplace justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories.